You have both led intriguing lives as radical activist intellectuals. Tell us when you got started on this path. Was there a special incident that provoked your involvement, or something in your family background that prompted your activism?
I got to remember farther back, so I'll go first. Well, I was a child of the Depression. Came from a good part of my family was it was an immigrant family, first-generation immigrants. Like other immigrant ethnic communities, very bound to the ethnic group, Jewish in this case. My immediate family, a lot of them were most of them, in fact, were working class people. That meant mostly unemployed, wide range of, it was a very lively period, and it was very intellectually alive, a lot of activism, and, you know, I sort of grew up in the middle of it. I don't know what to point to. I mean, I have early childhood memories of people coming to the door hungry, trying to sell rags, of traveling on streetcars with my mother and passing by strikes, textile strikes, where women were outside being beaten up by police. We have a very violent labor history in the United States, and unusual, in fact unique in the industrial world. And till the late 30s, workers were still getting murdered by private and government security forces. Meanwhile, fascism was extending over Europe. It was very frightening. I could see it as a child. We happened to be the only Jewish family in a very anti-Semitic neighborhood, and the immediate surroundings were scary, you know, especially with those black clouds in the background. There just was not ever much of a question. By the time I was 11 or 12, I was hanging around anarchist bookstores in New York and, you know, talking to guys who had escaped from Spain during the, you know, after the fascists took over, and so it continued.
When did I get started? My parents were activists, radicals before I was born. My father was working on something called the Texas white primary, and it was a Democratic primary. The South was all Democrat back then, and there were activists, both black and white, in East Texas trying to put an end to the all-white primary. My mother was active in school desegregation in Virginia at the time when blacks could go to black elementary school, black high school, and black colleges. But if you wanted to go to graduate school, there was no place in Virginia. So one of her friends was a plaintiff in a lawsuit against the state of Virginia to allow blacks to attend the University of Virginia so they could go to graduate school. And the state of Virginia settled it. And instead of allowing any black person to attend the University of Virginia, what they said is that they would pay their tuition to go to any college, any graduate school in the United States that would take them. So my mother took advantage of this and went to study. She was a mathematician. She went to study at the University of Michigan, which was a much better deal, actually, than University of Virginia. And my parents met there. So she had been an activist. He was an activist. He would come up from Texas and work on his PhD in rural social development, rural sociology, something that was called community development, but that at that time, at that era, very few people knew about it. So I was born into this family, but I was also born around the time that the McCarthy era was becoming very intense. And so even though my parents were active and most of their friends were activists, they never talked about it. I never heard about these things. I read about them much, much later. When I begin to remember as being a young child in Tuskegee Institute in Alabama in the 1940s and 50s, where I lived, Tuskegee Institute was 45 miles away from Montgomery, and it was a place where people who started the Montgomery bus boycott in the 1950s civil rights work would come and have meetings, and they'd plan to do things, and there were boycotts, and I remember going on boycotts, and I remember hearing about voter registration campaigns and lawsuits. I think Million versus Lightfoot is the suit about the gerrymander of Tuskegee. So the world in which I became conscious was an activist world challenging segregation. And then when I was 9 years old, my father stopped teaching at Tuskegee Institute. He went to work in a program that at that time was called Technical Cooperation Mission, later came to be called Agency for International Development. But he went to India in the 1950s at a time when the United States government was beginning to try in third world countries, in non-white areas, in non-European areas, to persuade the government not to be friendly with communists. And one of the ways they decided to persuade the government of India, which was very independent and had just gotten out of a colonial relationship with a European power, with Britain, was to persuade them that the United States was not like their former colonial power. And how did they do this? They found black technicians to send to India to work in villages. My father was one. He took me, and I just looked and saw a beautiful, impressive world in which the entire government and the entire country was run by people of color, and they seemed to be doing quite a good job. And so it was it never occurred to me that there was any validity or any sense or any reason for whites to run everybody's lives. So I immediately became totally incompatible, improperly socialized to grow up in Alabama. I mean, where I'm living, you know, the black people run the country, the minister and the president and the prime minister. But in Alabama, where my friends are growing up, their parents, who may have graduate degrees, who have skin color, they can't even vote. They can't vote, they can't do anything. So immediately I know this is wrong. Now the incident that kind of triggered my involvement was later. I was a high school student in 1962, I believe, 62, 63, and I saw on the pages of the newspaper outside of Philadelphia in the high school that I was attending. I was at a boarding school. My parents were living in Africa. I was there. There was one black professor, one black student from the town, 2 black boarders, and a Japanese student and an African. The rest of the people were white, everybody. So I'm in this world that's very white. It was the first time in my life. I'd lived in Africa and Asia and Macon County, and you don't see too many white people in any of those places. And these girls were in the back of a paddy wagon, and they were smiling and they were singing. And the story was about the Albany, Georgia protest against the denial of the right to vote, and the high school students who were getting arrested because they were protesting, and they would go to jail and they would sing. And what was so intriguing was that they were smiling, and I said, well, they look so happy. And a young woman put a sign outside the dining hall and said, we should fast in sympathy with the students from Albany who are fasting in jail. And I went on in the dining hall, didn't think about it, and the next day I came in and there was another sign up that said, fasting is stupid. We shouldn't do that. We should find something more cooperative to do to solve this problem. And I became infuriated. Who is this student? Of course, they're all white, because and I know it wasn't one of the black students who put this note up. So who is this white boy who's so protected, who has a superior attitude that he can tell young black women in Georgia who are risking their lives to change the system what they should do? So I just became infuriated, decided I was going to find out everything about that struggle. I went to Philadelphia. I talked to activists who trained people to go down to Albany. I wrote everything down. I came back in a fury, wrote out a 2-page speech, and asked if I could speak at the assembly. Our school had an assembly every Tuesday and Thursday. And I asked the art teacher, who was my friend. She said, oh, sure. She didn't ask me what I wanted to talk about. I said, sure, Kathleen, you can speak at the assembly. And I got up and I read this speech and told them what this movement was about and what these students were doing and why they were doing it and why Martin Luther King was right and why nonviolence was a good thing and why they should support them. And literally, I had no idea that this would upset people. It's a Quaker school. I thought they were for nonviolent protest. Well, that's the event that sort of got me going. And then in the same town, Tuskegee, where I was from, one of my classmates, a young man I grew up with, when I was a college student here in New York, was murdered, shot in the back by a gas station attendant. My friend's name was Sammy Young. He was a student, he was a SNCC worker, he was an activist, and he was murdered after receiving lots and lots and lots of death threats, but he was murdered in an argument with a white gas station attendant over which bathroom he was going to use, the one that used to be identified for white men or the one that used to be identified for colored males, because the signs had been taken down. He was shot in the back and left at the Greyhound bus station across the street. And that incident was very personal, very painful, and I'd say 6 months later I was no longer a college student, I was a civil rights worker, I was a full-time civil rights worker, and gradually just became more and more revolutionary as the resistance against our efforts to change the society increased.
Okay.
What a short answer.
No, it's a good answer. What has allowed you both to maintain your momentum for so many years? And I should, all of us know that many people our age have fallen by the wayside. The politics change, you get older, you're thinking about all kinds of things, but both of you have continued on in doing the work that you do. What makes that possible?
Like another reason.
The real reason, the secret, the reason no one will tell you is that it's joyful to struggle. You always feel, at least I feel, happiest when I know I'm doing something that can in some way break through and break down the kind of barriers that restrict people's ability to be creative, to be whole, to be healthy, and it makes me happy. Now, it makes a lot of other people feel different things, and sometimes I've wondered, as I walk into situations where people are trying to kill me or walk into situations where it looks like, oh, this might be it, I don't really feel joy then, but I will say that I talked my father into letting me join the civil rights movement with this argument. I said, you're sending me to college. You're paying, now you can tell how long ago this was, you're paying $800 a semester. I'm not getting a good education. Give me the money, let me join the movement, and I'll really get an education. And he said, okay, I'll do it for 1 year. And I took the money and I went to the civil rights movement because the movement was so collapsed, it had not enough, didn't have money to pay people's salaries. So I lived on like $100 a month. At the end of the year, he told me, your year is up. You have to go back to college. That was our deal. And I said, but I'm in the middle of a revolution. I can't go back to school. And he said, well, I can't send you any more money. So I stayed in the revolution, and I didn't ever have a lot of money, but I learned more than I'd ever learned in my life. I became an entirely different kind of very competent person with all the kinds of skills that I could potentially have developed. Each one was developed because I was forced to do things. And I enjoy learning, and I enjoy interacting with people, and I enjoy the exhilaration of feeling somehow or other we can change this culture and make a difference. That's what keeps me going.
Well, I guess we really are at opposite poles in a lot of respects. I feel the same way you do with regard to the last sentence. I think there are things we can do. But to tell you the honest truth, if the world would go away, I can think of a lot of things I'd much rather do than be involved in political activism. I don't particularly enjoy it. I don't like big groups. I don't even like talking to big groups. I'm sorry, I apologize. But I certainly don't like to go to meetings. I hate to go to jail. I don't like to be maced. Demonstrations I can't stand, and so on. But that's the honest truth. But they're just, they're just things you have to do. They take a look at it doesn't take any imagination. All it takes is to have your eyes open, to see that really awful things are going on in the world. You can start at arm's length. You don't have to go very far. Just take a walk downtown. It's enough. Actually, take a walk to Kendall Square and look at what's happening. People begging for food and so on. And then you can go far off to the rest of the world and find more. In fact, if you have a little imagination, you can think about what kind of a world we'll be leaving to future generations who don't have any voice. It doesn't seem to me possible to pay attention to those things, or to be alive, and not to be aware of all of that. And it doesn't seem possible to be aware of it and not to try to do something about it, even if you don't enjoy it. And mostly I don't, to tell you the truth. Although there are satisfactions, plenty of satisfactions. I mean, most worthwhile causes, I think, I assume, are going to fail because they're worthwhile because they're struggles against power and authority. And the way the world works is it runs, unfortunately, mostly by force. There's people called intellectuals who try to explain that in their own country and their own institutions it isn't like that, but it's just not true. And that means that most things that are worth doing are going to involve a large measure of failure, sometimes disastrous failure, because you're running up against powerful and brutal forces. Sometimes there's a degree of success. I mean, over a long period, I think you can see general progress. And some of the activities have, you can see specific progress, even particular people that are helped and groups that are helped and so on. But it's small successes, hard work. I don't particularly find it, it wouldn't be my first choice. If I was just thinking how to, sort of be happy, I'd much rather be in my study working, to tell you the truth. But there's no choice as far as I can see. There's no choice if you want to be able to look yourself in the mirror, at least.
Variously defined as the 60s, the 70s, or the revolution, or the counterculture, that 30 years that followed the end of World War II has taken on mythic proportions. Nowadays, books, films, TV productions, and popular culture have revived interest in that era's movements, fashions, music, and politics. What stands out to you as significant about that time?
Actually, I think the most significant things about that period, many of them were written by the people who were most outraged by it and organized a very significant counterattack, which we've been living with ever since, to destroy everything that was achieved then. And they're pretty articulate and reasonably intelligent. And some of them have published things that you really ought to read. Everybody ought to read. I was teaching undergraduate courses here for about 25 years on political topics, off on my own time, a lot of fun. But one thing we always had students read was, as soon as it came out, was a book called The Crisis of Democracy, which was the first publication of the Trilateral Commission. It was published in 1975. Trilateral Commission was founded by David Rockefeller, and it brought together Trilateral because it brought together elite elements from the three, what's called the triad, Japan, the United States, and Europe, three rich areas. These were mostly liberal elites, incidentally. It's the group of people who were around the Carter administration. In fact, the Carter administration was drawn entirely from that group, including Carter, so that gives you roughly their political complexion. They were scared to death by what happened in the 60s. The Crisis of Democracy, and they're very frank about it. It was not meant to be read. It was, in fact, as soon as people started reading it, I noticed it went off the market. But it was meant to be sort of an internal discussion among sort of smart guys. The American rapporteur was from big professor at Harvard. What terrified them, and they're very frank about it because it's basically an internal document, is the fact that during the 1960s, great masses of people who are ordinarily apathetic and obedient and do what they're told and don't get anybody's hair and so on, became organized and politicized and started to think for themselves and find their own ways of living, challenge authority, or put forth their demands in the political arena. That really drove them up the wall. That's the crisis of democracy. The institutions were no longer working anymore. In fact, what they call the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, meaning universities, schools, churches, and so on. The universities that were responsible for the indoctrination of the young were not doing their job. The young were getting out of control. They were, challenging authority. They were getting interested in crazy stuff like truth and justice and freedom and all that kind of business, and actually trying to do something about it. And what's more, they were really changing the country. I mean, the country really changed. It's a very different and much more civilized country than it used to be in the early 1960s in many, many respects. And this was extremely frightening to elite groups, including liberal elites. And their proposals were to try to find ways to beat back this challenge, to try to, as the American Harvard professor put it, to restore the good old days. He described it with a little bit of exaggeration. He said back in the days of the Truman years, Truman was able to govern the country with the help of a few Wall Street lawyers and financiers. Sorry for the attack on lawyers. So in those days, few Wall Street lawyers and bankers or something like that could run the country, but in the 60s, this was all getting out of control. I mean, all this rabble was getting around, this mass of people who aren't supposed to be doing anything, they're just supposed to be following orders. And we have to restore indoctrination and passivity and apathy. And there's been, in fact, from that time, a major doctrinal attack against an assault on the universities, and a very strong effort to narrow even further the rather narrow spectrum of kind of respectable discussion, the media and so on. At the same time, there's been a struggle against it. But what they were pointing to is quite real. I mean, all of those things were happening. They happened in a very exciting way. They happened. It was mostly young people. There had been the same attack. This is a cycle that we keep going through in American history. So the 1920s were an extremely apathetic period. In fact, the labor movement was totally smashed, mostly by violence at that time. And the place looked like the end of history. Everybody was talking about wonderful, it's all over, everybody follows orders, the rich guys get richer, and so on. The 1930s broke that up. It was a period of activism on all fronts, really changed things. Immediately afterwards, in fact, by the late 30s, there was a major assault on it. That's the McCarthyism. It was kind of held off by the war for a couple of years, but then it picked up steam right in the late 40s. It's called McCarthyism, but McCarthy was a latecomer. And in fact, in my opinion, not all that important. I mean, the main things were going on, again, often led by liberal elites, well before McCarthy, and much more destructive. And the 50s became very quiet and apathetic, not as bad as the 20s, but pretty bad. And again, there were a lot of predictions. It's all over, everything's in order, nobody's going to bother us anymore. And then the 60s came along, blew it out of the water, terrified the same groups. Assault starts over again. We beat back the crisis of democracy. We're living in the middle of that reaction now. The things that they were worried about were real and important. And they made the country more free, more just, more honest. They changed styles. I mean, like take, say, MIT. Back in 1960, nobody would be dressed like this. I was wearing a coat, a jacket, and a tie, and students were respectful, and I didn't say respectable, and those things are not just symbols. First of all, there were no women, like there's very few women, no people of color. It's a nice. It was like your image of the 1950s. That's what it really was. These changes from dress style to personal relations to respect for other cultures, to concern for rights, all of these things were perfectly real. They made the country a lot more civilized. They've resisted the attack. The assault has been very significant, but it's been resisted. But I think if you ask what were the 60s about, I think exactly what scandalized respectable people. That's what the 60s were about.
I grew up in the 60s. I went to high school. I think I started in 1959. I started college in 1963. I got married in 1967. I had children in 69 and 70. So this is like from 15 to 25. That's that period of time, that decade. And then, so my sense of it is quite different in the sense that I thought I was in the baby boomer until I read some magazine that said, oh no, you have to be born in 46. So I guess I'm not quite a baby boomer. But there was a huge thrust of people about the same age going into educational institutes at the same time in a level and at a pace that had never happened before. And that's true of blacks and whites. And so to me, the thing that is significant is what I will refer to as the student movement. But the student movement is a very powerful and very diffuse thing, because the student population was the largest cohort that had ever in history been in college in the United States. So you have movements of students in black colleges, for example, who are challenging the extraordinarily authoritarian structure of that college. You had students at white universities who were challenging the authoritarian structure of their college after having been participants, let's say, in a civil rights summer led by students who had joined the civil rights movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE, some other group. The student movement was the base out of which the anti-war movement, that was the mass movement, not the, there was anti-war movements and pacifist movements in this country from quite some time ago, but the mass movement of anti-war protest came out of the student movement, and the women's movement came out of the student movement. All the women who were involved in what became women's movement or women's liberation were women who were just as educated as these men who were in the same organizations they were in, and the men were always taking leadership positions and the women were taking notes. And some of the women began to say, well, why do I have to listen to you? My education is just as good. And the women's movement upset quite a bit of the emotional stability of men in the radical movements. I think it was Todd Gitlin who wrote that the era of the late 60s and early 70s was, he said it was exhilarating for women and very horrible for men, or something like that. And I couldn't quite figure out what his problem was until I realized that he was one of the men who was in a position of leadership in an organization that was working along old rules, even though it was supposed to be New Left. So the thing, though, to me that stands out as significant, as the most significant, as if this did not happen, you would not have that era called the 60s or the 70s. We would not have the explosion of imaginative music and literature and theater. The thing that triggered it for me was the Vietnam War. On the one hand, that's a foreign event, but it has so many profound internal consequences for the United States, which I will start in 1954. I mean, that's at the point in which the French are defeated in Indochina, and America begins to take on a military and political role of sustaining a different type of government in Vietnam and supporting the anti-communists. And the reason I picked that date, 1954, is because the other very significant thing was the Brown decision by the United States Supreme Court that was also handed down in 1954, taking the position for the first time in 105 years, I believe, since Plessy. The Plessy decision says separation, separate but equal facilities, racial lines are constitutional. The Brown decision says segregation in education is unconstitutional. And the way that was interpreted in black communities was with exuberance and exhilaration, as the Supreme Court has said segregation is unconstitutional. It is said in education, but it was interpreted, and the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement, leaped. I mean, from that day, from the May 19th, or what date that decision was made, the movement took off. And so those two events interacting within the context of the United States gave it a dynamic, gave it a sense of purpose, a sense of possibility, also a sense of horror. I was in a movement that was very internationalist and looked at liberation struggles in Africa, liberation struggles in Asia, in China, in Cuba, and continually said if the Vietnamese can win their independence from the United States, if they can fight against the most powerful military behemoth in the world, so can we. And so that kind of dynamic and that kind of willingness to risk your life and put everything on the line to change that the Vietnam War allowed, I think significantly altered all the other possible struggles, and it generated such internal dissension and protest among whites that the whole cultural hierarchy fell apart and has been put back together, but it's not the same.
Thank you. Students often ask me, what happened, why did the 60s stop? That's sort of the question they ask. What happened to the 60s? And I always say, and also students have said to me, why did you all give up? And I've often said that I don't think the movement stopped voluntarily. And so I want to ask the question about the government's COINTELPRO, we call it COINTELPRO, but it's Counterintelligence program that was directed at that era and the individuals who were operating in that era and the groups that were most active in that era, and ask each of you, how did the COINTELPRO program, and you can of course elaborate on it a little bit more and explain it a little bit more than I have right now, how did that program affect both of you?
You got more dramatic stories too, I think. Well, first of all, the idea that let me just start with the kind of presupposition. The idea that the 60s came to an end is completely wrong. I mean, if you think of the movements, sorry, I was saying that the idea that the 60s movements ended is completely false. In fact, that's propaganda. It's part of the propaganda that is trying, and so far failing, to get people back to passivity and obedience. If you just think back, I mean, some of you too young to remember, but you know anyway. If you think of the movements that have really had a major effect on the life and the culture and the society and the way we act with one another and so on and so forth, they're movements of the 70s, not of the 60s. The feminist movement, as Kathleen said, that's a movement of the 70s. And that's probably had maybe a broader effect on the whole culture than anything else I can think of. The environmental movements are movements of the 70s. Nothing existed in the 60s. And that's, there's a kind of a deep moral thrust behind that. It's saying we care about the world that's going to exist in the future, not just for ourselves, but what it means for other people, people who don't have a vote in the marketplace, if you want to use that ridiculous idiom. One of the many respects in which it's a grotesque system. But the solidarity, I mean, let's take even the anti-war movement, the Vietnam anti-war movement. It was a very important thing. I mean, I spent a lot of time and effort and suffering and so on in it. Was pretty close to going to jail for a long time, in fact, missed by a miracle. But despite all that, let me just tell you that the Vietnam War movement, anti-war movement, was very small as compared with the solidarity movements of the 1980s. So, for example, in the 1960s, nobody dreamed of going to live in a Vietnamese village in the hope that a white face might limit the violence of the state terrorists that the U.S. was organizing, or U.S. forces themselves. Could have had, it might well have limited the violence, but it's not an idea that even occurred to anyone. Well, thousands of people did that in the 1980s. Not people from the left particularly. A lot of them were coming from, Midwestern Christian fundamentalist groups. But there was just a sense that the United States was carrying out a violent terrorist war in the 1980s, mainly targeting the church, in fact. The church, popular organizations and so on, that's part of the attack on the crisis of democracy had spread to Central America. And there you do it a little more harshly than you do here, And it was very brutal. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. It was monstrous and so on. It would have been a lot worse if the opposition to it had been only at the level of the 60s. They could never send B-52s. They had to organize an international terror network instead of sending U.S. military forces directly. And it was because of the turmoil and the ferment and the literal participation. I mean, there were tens of thousands of people from here who went down to see what was going on and share the lives of the people, maybe protect them, help, and so on. Nothing like that was even conceivable in the 1960s. The difference is quite dramatic. So these movements lasted. Not only lasted, but they grew and they expanded and they continued and still going on. You know, in the at the peak of the anti-war movement, say 1965, 1966, you could not have conceivably have had a group not only like this, you couldn't have filled a classroom at MIT with people interested in these things. Let me tell you from experience. When we were trying to have meetings against the Vietnam War at places like MIT and Harvard, incidentally, in the mid-60s, we would put together half a dozen issues. You know, the Vietnam War, Vietnam, Venezuela, you know, Iran, you know, the price of bread. I mean, maybe you figure if you get 10 issues, you know, you might be able to get 20 people to come out and maybe listen. I mean, when I started giving talks, there were literally I mean, like give a talk in a church, you know, with 4 people there, you know. The guy who organized it, some guy was out in the streets and was cold, and 2 people who wanted to kill you. You know, that's, in fact, Boston's a pretty liberal city, you know, but as late as mid-1966, that's when there were hundreds of thousands of American troops in Vietnam, and the country was virtually devastated. You know, killed hundreds of thousands of people. At that time, we could not have a public meeting against the war in Boston. You couldn't have a meeting at the Boston Common or at the Arlington Street Church, even in a church, because it would simply be attacked by counter-demonstrators, violently attacked by counter-demonstrators, many of them students, incidentally, you know, marching over from the colleges to destroy it, with the applause of the press, including the liberal press. Now, that's what the world was like at the peak of the Vietnam War. It changed dramatically, and a lot of it changed because of the movements of the 70s and the 80s. You know, these things remained. They have fought off the attempts at repression. They've been growing. The belief that it's collapsed is simply false. Anybody who's thinks about what's happened knows that's not true. Well, that's kind of only on your first sentence. On COINTELPRO. You know.
Because that actually is part of what you're saying is a COINTELPRO.
Well, COINTELPRO, right. COINTELPRO is a very significant thing, and you should, again, if you don't know about it, you should learn about it. It's 1,000 times more significant than, say, Watergate. I mention Watergate because the expose of COINTELPRO and of Watergate was just about exactly at the same time. In comparison to COINTELPRO, Watergate was a tea party. The only reason why anybody pays attention to Watergate is the targets were rich, powerful people, and rich, powerful people fight back. You know, like the head of the Ford Foundation and the president, the CEO of IBM and those guys, or the Democratic Party, which is, after all, half of the power in the country. You fiddle around with them, they get rid of you. You know, they're powerful and rich, and that's considered a scandal. To go after, nothing incidentally happened at Watergate. For example, everybody was totally scandalized by Nixon's enemies list, you know, pages, all of it. I mean, I was on Nixon's enemies list, you know. They never even audited my income tax. I mean, you know, it's meaningless, totally meaningless thing. But the point is, rich, powerful, not me, of course, but, you know, rich, powerful people were on Nixon's enemies list. So it was a scandal. I mean, the break-in of the Democratic Party headquarters, you know, nobody even knows what it was for. You know, it was a couple of sort of, you know, crooks who were gathered together for some unknown purpose who did nothing. You know, I mean, but it became a huge scandal because they were powerful people they were attacking. Let's turn to COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO, which was revealed at the same time. It's the very same time, not very little in the press or anywhere else. It came out in the courts, you know, Freedom of Information Act. Mostly courts just released documents. Well, it turns out that since the Eisenhower administration and right up till Nixon, the government had been It's not a little group of people put together by Nixon when he was drunk or something, but the federal government, through 4 administrations, were running a terrorist program against dissent. Literally a terrorist program, major terrorist program. I mean, it started, it began against the Communist Party back in the 50s. Under Kennedy, it really took off. The Puerto Rican nationalists, other groups, and so on, what they called black nationalists quickly became a target, Panthers in particular were devastated by it. The women's movement as a whole was attacked as soon as it began to come into existence. The New Left across the board. In fact, there was virtually nothing that was left out. Maybe the Panthers were the most viciously attacked. At the time, we now know a lot from released documents. At the time, according to the FBI, the Panthers had 800 members. But they were devoting enormous efforts to destroy the party because it was doing things like running free breakfast programs in churches and things like that. And it reached the level of outright political assassination. The literal Gestapo-style political assassination. The person who was the most extreme case in the COINTELPRO records was the assassination of Black Panther leader Fred Hampton, who's an organizer in the Chicago ghettos. Now, they were not going after him because he was a criminal or anything else. He was anything but. He was a very effective organizer. That's the kind of guy they want to kill. The FBI tried to get a criminal gang in the ghetto, Blackstone Rangers. They tried to incite the Rangers to kill him by sending faked letters. I mean, you read the letters, they're so idiotic. I don't think they remember those letters, did you? I don't know how they could imagine that anybody would believe they were, got some FBI agent putting on black dialect or something, dear brothers. It was kind of like, if it hadn't been so awful, it would have been a comic strip. But the idea was to try to get the Rangers to believe that the Panthers had a contract out to kill their leaders, and then they'd go kill them. Well, that didn't work, so they just took it over directly. It was a combined operation of the FBI and the Chicago police, which simply went in and murdered him 4 o'clock in the morning, probably drugged, killed a couple other people. There was an attempt to cover it up, but couldn't keep, came out in the courts. I mean, there's no doubt about what happened. In comparison with this, what's Watergate? In fact, one of the minor elements of COINTELPRO, really minor, was an attack on a political party. A political party which is every bit as legitimate as the Democratic Party, Socialist Workers' Party. All the rights of the Democratic Party, right? Only one difference between the Socialist Party and the Socialist Workers' Party and the Democratic Party. Socialist Workers' Party is a few powerless people. The Democratic Party is half the wealth in the country. Well, in the case of the Socialist Workers' Party, they didn't send in some, Keystone cops to steal some documents for no known reason. The FBI, which is the national political police, went after them and tried to destroy them. They robbed their offices, they stole their records, they tried to get employers to blacklist their members. They tried to destroy the party. I mean, infinitely worse than anything that happened to the Democrats. Anybody care? No? I mean, does anybody know about COINTELPRO and as compared with Watergate? No, and that tells you something about the elite culture that we're all trained in and brought up in when we get our degrees at Harvard and so on. What matters is if you do things to people with power. That's bad. If you do infinitely worse things to powerless people, doesn't even merit a footnote in history. And you just look at the coverage of these two events which came out at the same time, and it makes it very clear. Incidentally, MIT was also targeted by COINTELPRO. This is pretty minor, I should say, as compared with the things that Kathleen can tell you about, or that I just mentioned. It's nothing, but the FBI did try to disrupt courses at MIT, mine. Incidentally, whether any of this stuff ever happened, I don't know, but it's in the FBI records. The government was required under court order around 1980, I guess, to release documents to people who were targeted by illegal COINTELPRO activities. I don't have to add illegal because they're all radically illegal. So in the course of that, we got some documents. Louis Kempf, who many of you know, and I were teaching courses, I think I mentioned, for many years here. And they tried to disrupt them. We had a lot of students, and there were assistants, and some of the assistants were people who'd been active in the civil rights movement and the student movement and so on. The first document, got a set of documents. First one comes from the Boston FBI office to J. Edgar Hoover in Washington, saying, "Our source within MIT," and then comes a black line. We spent a lot of time trying to decipher. But our source, if you've ever looked at these documents, they're half blacked out. Our source within MIT tells us that you know, these student assistants, these bad guys are teaching in this course. This is a good opportunity for a disinformation effort and to try to undermine it and get rid of them and so on and so forth, and disrupt the course and so on. And they need authorization from Washington. They get authorization from Washington. And then, you know, it goes up and back for a lot of boring communications. And the last one says, our source within MIT, you know, blank, tells us that our operation was a terrific success. I mean, we got rid of these guys, you know, the whole thing's wrecked and so on and so forth. Well, you know, that is such a tiny footnote to COINTELPRO. I'm embarrassed even to mention it. I do because it's close to home. But this was a, you know, it's a major project. Theoretically, it was ended when it was exposed. I don't see any reason to believe that it was ended. But it's because, you know, that it's just not. Maybe going on under some other name or something. Well, that's COINTELPRO. It was no joke. You know, I think people were killed. The worst case was the Hampton assassination. Lives were destroyed, and it was a major attack on dissent, any kind of dissent, across the board by the end. And it had its effects. It certainly disrupted and harmed plenty of people, killed some. I think in the case of the Panthers, it probably destroyed them. You know, it's one thing for rich white folks like us to, you know, say, okay, you laugh at it when they do this stuff to us. It's quite different if you're a poor, defenseless person in the ghetto. Very different. It had its effects, but to say that it ruined the movement is just not. It did ruin a lot of things. It may have very seriously harmed the black movement. But other things continued and in fact grew and expanded, and they can continue to.
Well, I'll talk a little bit about what COINTELPRO was only in terms of the FBI, but the concept of counterintelligence was much broader than the FBI. We focused in on the FBI because they were the most visible and the things they did were the closest to us. But for example, let's take a city like Los Angeles. There's the FBI racial squad that's operating to get rid of black radicals and revolutionaries, and they focus in on the Black Panthers. In the Los Angeles Police Department, there is the criminal conspiracy squad, and their focus is to get rid of black radicals, in particular Black Panthers. So they work together. And in the Central Intelligence Agency, they have their own particular units doing the same thing. In the Department of Defense Intelligence, they have their units doing things. In the National Security Agency, they have their units doing the same thing. And so what we didn't know, we said, yes, it was a police state and they were out to get us, but what we had no idea was the amount of agencies and the amount of money and the amount of technology that was used to destroy us. But just look at one particular individual, a young man named Elmer Geronimo Pratt, who was discharged from the United States Army in, I think, about 1968, took his GI Bill, went to UCLA in a program called High Potential to get a college degree. He met another Black Panther named Alprentice Bunchy Carter in that program. Carter recruited him into the Black Panther Party, and within 7 months, Alprentice Carter was murdered on the UCLA campus after a black student meeting by Carter and John Huggins were murdered on the UCLA campus after a black student meeting to discuss who was going to run the African American, I think at that time they call it Black Studies program. The university had picked someone named Ron Karenga. The students felt that they should be included in the decision making and invited a couple of Panthers to this meeting. Bunchy Carter told all the Panthers before they came to the meeting, look, we're not in any kind of conflict with Karenga. We don't have anything against him. We're only going there because the students ask us, and no one should bring any weapons. So this is a very calm, unexciting student meeting, at the end of which an incident is provoked by someone in us saying something to a woman named Elaine Brown who had ties with the Black Panther Party. She says something to John Huggins. Gunfire ensues. 2 Panthers are dead. the FBI agent who wrote about it, a man named Wes Swearingen, who has subsequently revealed a lot of his information in a book called FBI Secrets, says the agents came back, the 2 FBI agents plus the 2 blacks in the US organization who were their infiltrators, came back upset, saying that wasn't supposed to happen. There wasn't supposed to be any shooting on the campus. And the reason why? They weren't supposed to be killed on the campus because some white students might have been killed in the gunfire. They were supposed to have been killed, but somewhere else. So that's just one little January 1969 incident, an example of counterintelligence work within the Black Panther Party, against the Black Panther Party, and the purpose was not only to kill the leadership of a particular branch, it was very powerful, but to also instigate conflict and warfare between 2 different or you might say rival black activist nationalist groups. Now that's a microcosm. What was going on across the country was equally, if not more, vicious. That happened 7 months, I believe, before a year before. Fred Hampton was murdered in December of '69, and Carter was murdered in January. Some of the groups, for example, that the FBI was spying on, infiltrating, and collecting information on for its so-called agitator index. And if you're on the agitator index, certain things would happen to you under different circumstances. But these are the organizations they looked at: American Nazi Party, anti-Vietnam activists, Black Nationalists, Black Panther Party, Communists, Congress of Racial Equality, Ku Klux Klan, Latin American. This is out of the Select Committee report on intelligence activities, otherwise known as the Church Committee. Minutemen, Nation of Islam, National States Right Party, Progressive Labor Party, nationalist groups advocating independence for Puerto Rico, Revolutionary Action Movement, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Students for a Democratic Society, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Socialist Workers Party, Workers' World Party, and then there's another one called Miscellaneous. Now, those are just some of the groups they're looking at. They had programs involving the CIA operating domestically. They had programs involving the CIA operating internationally. I remember reading in the New York Times while I was doing some research as a student about a particular program under, when all the reporting about Watergate was going on, that the same little crew that initiated the Watergate break-in had initiated break-ins into the Guinea embassy. The purpose of breaking into the embassy of Guinea was because that country represented Algeria in the United States. Algeria and the United States did not have diplomatic relations. The Black Panther Party had an international section in Algeria. The Nixon White House was convinced that the Algerian government was financing not only the Black Panther Party but other movements and wanted proof of this finance. And the CIA had informed him, no, they're not being financed. And he wouldn't believe it. So they had 3 break-ins into the Guinea embassy to get proof of this finance. And there were, over and over, people would visit you, people would interact with you, they would send letters to you. I got letters all the time, and I was so busy I didn't read most of them, but they tried to disrupt your relationships with other people. For example, I got a letter that said, "Dear Kathleen, you are such a nice person. I hate to be the one to break this bad news, but I just want you to know your husband is having an affair with a white woman who lives at such and such and such a street," and it had an address. And then it was signed, "A soul sister." So I said, if you won't tell me who you are, why should I believe you? And I threw it away. I mentioned to William Kunstler, very, very dynamic lawyer, that incident, just in passing, and he said, yeah, my wife got those kind of letters too, but she believes them all. And so they did all sorts of little insidious, petty things to make you not trust the people you lived with, to break up marriages, to destroy people by killing them, to destroy people by having them arrested, to destroy people by making you think that they were a police agent when they weren't. There was a vast array of techniques done, climates created, harassment used, and this is on top of just everyday regular arrests and trials and poverty. So what happened, people were beaten down, and I always say we did not disappear, we did not go out of existence, we were destroyed. And it doesn't matter if the individuals, all the individuals were not destroyed. What was destroyed was their link, their organizational structure, their newspapers, and even more importantly, the links with other organizations. For example, in Chicago, Fred Hampton had created something called the Rainbow Coalition, and it brought together a white organization, radical group called the Young Patriots, Puerto Rican group called the Young Lords, an Asian group, the Iwar Kun, or the Red Guards, the Blackstone Rangers, and the Black Panthers. And we had other similar coalitions in the Bay Area. We had coalitions with the Peace and Freedom Party, which is an electoral organization predominantly white, and the Brown Berets, which are a Chicano group, and the Iwar Kun, an Asian group. So when you have radical revolutionary groups pulling together, challenging racism, working together, and you destroy those organizational links, even if the people are still in the same place, their movements aren't. And even if the people are physically there, they don't trust people anymore. So you destroy the motion even though you don't destroy the people.
Ooh, that brought me back in time for myself. What have each of you learned from the other's work? Very simple question.
I always believe in depersonalizing questions, if you don't mind. The important thing is not what one person learned from another person, but what you learn from the kinds of activities and organizations that other people are involved in. So, can I change question? Okay. Because otherwise it's just like individual accident. Doesn't have any general meaning. Well, I mean, so let's take the Panthers, say. I was at the time that the Panthers became visible, what was that, 66 or so? Around 66.
I think 67?
Yeah, around then, 66, 67. At that time, I was extensively involved with a group that I'd helped organize. It was, and still exists, and actually has its offices here in Boston. It's called Resist, which was it was the first and major resistance, a group of people involved in resistance or supporting resistance. We were a bit older, like we were in our 40s, say, so a lot of it was resistance support. Some of it was direct resistance, like organizing tax resistance and the kinds of things we could do directly, and all sorts of other activities. But it was a resistance group and a resistance support group, actually. Was brought to trial in the Spock case, if you remember that. By 66 and 67, by the time the Panthers, were sort of visible on the scene, the group had extended its interests. It had a large number of, the participants were activists of all kinds from around the country, and a number of them were people who worked mostly in the urban ghettos. So we were sort of hearing things from the inside about what was going on at our annual monthly meetings. People from the group have gone all sorts of ways. One, I regret to say, a good friend has been in jail for 20 years. A wonderful person, and others, various things happened to. But we did sort of know what was going on from direct participation, then of course we could follow, and we decided that as our interests were spreading to many other activities beyond specifically resistance to the war in Vietnam, which is what it started with, that we ought to do something, this was something we ought to become involved in. And I myself and others started trying to become involved at that time. Now, I don't want to exaggerate, I'm not going to organize workers in the GE factory in Lynn, and I'm not going to organize people in Roxbury. I mean, that's not me, But we were a solidarity group. We figured there are things that we can do that would be helpful and supportive, using our own privilege. I mean, we're very privileged. Most of us, certainly me, extremely privileged, way more than we ought to be, and we can use it. You can use it in a lot of ways. You can use it to give material support. You can use it to give, you have intellectual resources that aren't available to people who are less privileged. You can just be there. That makes a difference. You can participate in ways which can, for example, reduce violence. or can, help activities go on and so on. So we became involved as a kind of a solidarity group, kind of like third world solidarity groups, in Central America or Africa or whatever, except this one was right at home, including Boston. And that continued until, at least for me personally, until the Hampton assassination. My own last direct participation was to fly out to Chicago at the request of friends and a family of his to be at the funeral. It was not a happy occasion. When I came back here, I gave a talk in Kresge, in fact, and there were a fair number of people about it, and we tried to do some more things, but by then, at that time, I think the attack on the Panthers had been sufficiently successful, so they really couldn't recover. That's when my connections essentially dropped aside from continuing to write about it and speak about it, and I was involved with the family during the trials and that kind of thing. But that's just my personal involvement.
I was in Paris. My former husband had left Algeria. The international section was disbanded, and we were living in France. I'm not sure whether we were there legally or illegally at the time, and a book was published in France that Chomsky wrote that had been banned or not allowed to be released in the United States. And in France, the title was Bain de Sang, which is bloodbath. And it was a protest against and condemnation of the kind of war activities that we ourselves protested. And I always remember this just very gory title and his name as someone who was singular in their concentrated attack on the same things that we were up against, but he attacked them in a way that was probably a little more respectable and more researched than we did. But I like the name, and I was going to tell you that I've moved, I don't know how many times, let's say 55 times since then. I just pack up and move, pack for various reasons, go to school, change jobs, whatever, get away from this person or that person. But one of your books always seems to end up in my house.
Probably about 5 copies.
No, this is the Mandarin's. But I've actually stolen books of his or borrowed books of his from other people so I could read them, never returned them. So if I had to describe the influence, I would use the language that other people would agree with me. He stands like a beacon or like a lighthouse out over a sea of hogwash that you've been told all this stuff that's not true. So thank you.
Okay. A beacon over a sea of hogwash. Remember that. Actually, there are two. I'll combine 2 last questions, and then we need to open up so that people can ask questions from the audience. I'll kind of. I think that.
You're trying to make these 2 one?
No, I'm trying to make. Well, I think that we only have. We're about now at the 1 hour mark, so we. Longer?
We have longer. Don't worry about it.
The great state in the year 2000, since they have so much experience in backdrop.
We're not quite at questions yet. We'll be there in just a second. We're just going to I'll ask one more question then. Okay. Okay. What do you see as the major challenges facing young people now, of today, when they attempt to bring about social change, and try to, elaborate on that in whatever way that would be helpful for the people in the audience?
Well, I mean, the challenges, I think, you don't want me to tell you about them. If you look around, near you, far away, the future, and so on, you're going to find, if you're honest, lots of needless suffering and oppression. While we're having this meeting, if you believe UNICEF statistics, a couple of thousand children will die of malnutrition and disease. who could be saved for probably a few cents a day. I mean, not serious things. And maybe twice that many women will die or be seriously maimed from pregnancy-related or childbirth-related injuries, all because they don't have facilities that could easily be made available. That's just while we're meeting, thousands and thousands of people. You don't have to go very far from here to see it. I mean, I've walked through streets in Harlem, which were as horrifying as anything I've seen in the third world, and I've been to some of the poorest and most depressed parts of the third world. You look elsewhere, you find more. There is endless misery and suffering, and it's needless. It's there because our institutional structures are catastrophic failures. That's why it's there. You see it, you ask yourself, you recognize it, you ask yourself why it's there. There takes analysis. You want to understand what's going on and why. And then you simply ask what you can do about it. And the range of things you can do is endless. I mean, if you don't feel like doing anything yourself, you can help other people who are doing things, or you can become involved in indefinitely many ways. I mean, I won't insult your intelligence by trying to describe them. And it's a very individual matter. It depends. I know people have taken very different tracks, very honorable tracks, and my own children for that matter, and elsewhere, but very different ones. And it's a matter of you have to work it out for yourself. There's no right answer, at least that I know. Nor are there any techniques. I mean, throughout all of human history, these struggles have been going on, and they've been successful. The world is not very pleasant, but you don't have to go back very far when it was a lot more unpleasant. It's like we don't have slavery, literal slavery. Jails are bad, but not very long ago, civilized countries like Norway didn't have a lot of people in prison. The reason was that if a person robbed a store or something, you'd drive a stake through his hand, then you didn't need prisons. And we don't have to go very far back to see these things. A century ago, maybe the worst human being that human history has ever created, at least I can't think of anyone worse, was Joseph Mengele. His monstrous experiments under the Nazi period. You go back 100 years, right here in Boston, highly respected doctors were carrying out Mengele-type experiments. Their pictures are on the walls in Harvard Med School. Mengele-type experiments on Irish indigent women and black women, devising the techniques that are now used in gynecological surgery. You take a woman, you keep doing experiment after experiment and so on, and nothing was considered wrong about that. It was just like part of the culture. You go back 40 years and elementary things like, just ordinary respect for women's rights didn't exist. It's just in like our lifetimes, and you can make progress. There are a lot of things you can do, but it's never going to be easy. As I said, you have to expect that most worthwhile efforts are going to mostly fail. If they're worthwhile, they are confronting power and authority, and hence could very well fail and probably will, but there's a measure of success. If you ask what the challenges are, well, they're endless. Last comment, it's not easy. I mean, there's a cost. There's gains and there's costs, and you just have to make your own decisions. Some of the costs are more severe now than they were in the 60s. So in the 1960s, it was people your age in the 1960s could realistically believe, students at MIT, they could realistically believe that they could take a couple of years off and become involved in, some sort of devote themselves to activism and then come back and go off and end up with a, nice, rich career somewhere. That's not true anymore. There's a lot of discipline has come about by simply the economic constraints, which are not matters of economic law. They're matters of decision, decisions within institutions, which have very sharply restricted opportunity and impose discipline, because there are ways of ensuring that people who step out of line will not be able to step back into line. And there's no point denying that it's true, it's real, and you're going to have people face it. And that has a disciplinary effect. On the other hand, if you consider the problems that most of the, 99% of the people in the world face, the problems that people like most of us face are, you can't even mention them. I mean, yeah, there's a little repression. I mean, maybe you don't get the job you wanted, you know, maybe somebody yells at you or something like that. But it's nothing like what most of the people in the world have to live with. So to think that these are obstacles that can't be overcome just doesn't make any sense. There are endless possibilities, and the world is what you make of it.
Well, having become very active at a time when I could be a married woman, my husband had a job at a magazine that covered the rent, the car payments, and everything else you could imagine, and not me even having to question. I never knew what he made, or I knew what the rent was. But I really didn't know what the cost of our living was, and I spent all my time, full-fledged, 100%, all day, working in political movements, organizing demonstrations, working on newspapers, sending out press releases. This was my full-time employment from 1967 till, I think, probably about 1979. In 1979, I tried to go get a job. I had to make up things. I didn't really have any job history. But this is inconceivable now, that the financial demands of having a home, I don't care how, we lived in a studio apartment and then rented bigger things, but to rent an apartment or rent a house, to buy a home or buy a house, to own a car, to lease a car, to drive a car, puts a financial burden on a person that does not allow them to spend their full energy and full time in any kind of activism. There's other obstacles that seem to me very effective, but quite subtle, and that is the conceptual inability to conceive of the kind of collective action and enthusiastic collective action that existed under the pressure of mass mobilization and the Vietnam War and the threat of, we thought we were about to get killed as a people. We thought genocide was around the corner, and we had a sense of urgency and intensity about our organizing. But as an illustration, I was interviewed in Atlanta by a young reporter. I think she was about 25, 23, and she was asking me about my career. She couldn't get over the fact that there was a former Black Panther at Emory teaching, and a lot of people couldn't get over that. And so she kept asking me questions and things, and I said, well, I'll let you see this article I wrote, and it'll tell you something about about my life at that time. And it was an article I had written that was published in Ramparts about Eldridge and me and the movement, and at the end it said, please send contributions to repay the bail. He had left the country. I think his bail was $50,000, and people were going to send in contributions to pay this amount. And I said, and people did, and we got all the money. And she said, you did? This was inconceivable, that you could publish one article in one magazine and get thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars because people believed in what you were doing and supported you. I have people telling me it's inconceivable that 4 or 5 people can get together because they care enough about a project, rotate who works to pay their bills. The inability that they seem to have, young people seem to have, in departing from this individualistic notion of everybody having to have their own things and do their own thing, which is supported by the whole ideologically driven media and education, is that you can't think of yourself as part of a socially supportive collective group that enjoys being together and doing things together, and that this is valuable. I think that's a big obstacle. It can be done. I assure you, it is not hard. It's a lot of fun. But the obstacles, the financial and ideological obstacles that are put in place by the same people who brought you the Vietnam War are what's holding you back, in my opinion.
Well, thank you. We only have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions from the floor, I think. But we'll, because I think we'd said something about 9 o'clock or so. Boy, there's a whole line. So if you can keep your questions, yes. Okay, well, all right.
What did she say?
2 people at the mic. There's another mic over here if somebody wants to. Okay. And we'll just kind of alternate. Please ask your questions fairly, make them brief. And at this point, testimonials are not as much fun as asking a question and getting the answer. Okay. You.
Good night. I am from Guatemala. I am just a visitor here in this university, and both of you have an enormous experience about working in political movements and using or participating in armed popular struggle and questioning authority and power. My question is, in the landscape, in the perspective that you have, what kind of political future you see, and what kind of challenge you could mention for the political future between black people and Latino people in this country?
So who's going to?
I think, but tell me if I'm wrong, that you're asking what is the political future between black people and Latino people in the United States? Is that what you said? The political future?
Yeah. What kind of challenge? What kind of challenge you are seeing, according with your experience? What kind of challenge for the possibility to build a common agenda?
Ah, okay. Well, that's a good question. I heard from some people who had visited the Zapatistas in Mexico that the question that they kept asking, where are the black liberation fighters? Why don't they support us? Where are they? Why don't they come down here? And I remember reading, when I first read about the demands. We want land, peace, justice, bread, housing, and freedom. I said, but that's the same thing the Black Panther Party said. There's it's sort of an intrinsic identification with the same issues. However, there seem to be an enormous amount of social barriers, particularly, not necessarily in Central America, particularly in the United States, where when you talk about Latino people, too many instances of people who have been mistreated and abused and exploited, but their identification is white. They identify themselves as white, even though a lot of Latinos are obviously black, but their still identification is white, and the conflict and the dynamics in the United States are very antagonistic on a black-white axis. The closer you are to white, the view is the more privileges you have. The further away from white, the less privileges you have. So there's an antagonism that is benefiting the same power structure. And there have been efforts, particularly in California and the Southwest, where you have large black and Spanish-speaking communities to collaborate on certain political tasks, but on certain issues there's always a falling out, particularly if the issue evolves around immigration policy. So in my own view, the future depends on enlightened, committed leadership that's not self-serving and not corrupt. That means they're probably not running for office. But I think there's a lot of possibilities, and I think people have to start in organized activities, working together and building a sense of trust. And then when people trust each other, they'll work together and be able to get past some of these barriers. But the barriers were in place before we were born. So it takes an effort, it takes a commitment, but that doesn't mean it can't be done.
I was wondering, this is just a quick question. I don't think this mic is on, but anyway. I was wondering if you're aware of anybody who specifically, any scholars or any group that is specifically tracking the reactionary right-wing propaganda in the press. I know Professor Chomsky follows the media very closely. This is something that fascinates me. The Wall Street Journal, for example, has a racist diatribe on the editorial page almost every day. And it's amazing to me that nobody seems to notice this. Could you please comment on that?
Well, there are groups that are, including in Boston, that are concerned with what they call the radical right. But unfortunately, what you're describing is the racist center, and that's, to target that is to turn mirrors pretty close to home, and the only people who are really doing it, as far as I know, are, like on the media, are groups who do media critique, like, say, FAIR, you know, which does a group in New York-based group, which does do this kind of thing fairly regularly. But they're talking about, you know, like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and so on and so forth. The radical right is, you know, there are efforts to monitor them. But I agree with you. I think that's not the main problem. It's not the radical right. It's things like the Wall Street Journal, which are not very far away. You know, it's most of the milieu that most of us live in, which is imbued with racism. You know, and it's very deep. You know, I mean, none of us have failed to see plenty of it in our lives.
Along this street, there have to be about almost 3,000 black people, black students within this area. Something that hits me very close to home is I look into the audience and I see very few in the audience. A question that I have is that, you know, how do you provoke people to realize that there's still a lot of issues on the table that regard us, especially in a time when something like Proposition 209 has such a psychological effect on black students that the number of people who haven't applied to UCLA has dropped?
How do you do it? As I said before, if there's any techniques, they've been kept a secret for a couple of thousand years. The only things you can try to do are to educate yourself and others, and to organize together with others, and to undertake actions to combat these things. And that can be done in all sorts of ways. But there is no magic key. You know, it's simply a matter of continual engagement and struggle. And it's got to go on all the time. You know, you can't do it for 2 weeks and say, okay, it'll be over. These were indeed some of the illusions of the 60s. In the 1960s, it was largely a youth movement. Because of the effect of the, you know, the real repression of the 50s. And it wasn't repression like Guatemala, you know, where you murder a couple 100,000 people, but it was repression, which got people quiet. By the time the student movement took off, it was mostly dissociated from rich traditions in American society, which had been broken. And young people have, you know, did a lot of marvelous things, but often with a very weird perspective. So, for example, there were, like you take, say, the Columbia strike, which was a big event. I mean, a lot of the students involved in the Columbia strike, I know this from just personal contact, literally believed that if they shut down Columbia for a couple of weeks, that would, then the whole system would collapse. And after that, it would be, you know, freedom and love and peace and all kind of wonderful things. Well, you know, the world is, maybe that's what it looks like when you're 17 years old. I don't remember, frankly. But it doesn't work like that. You know, it is going to be constant struggle on every one of these things. There are going to be attempts to, you know, beat people back, to separate them from one another, to make, I mean, say, take affirmative action. I mean, you know, it's an issue on which you can get people to feel, privileged people to feel, look, I'm getting stepped on, okay? Yeah, and it's possible to extend those feelings to make people hate each other instead of looking at the ones who are really oppressing them, and that just has to be overcome. It often is. Like, for example, during the CIA organizing drives in the 30s, very intense black-white tension, hatreds were overcome because people were working together on something else. And that's happened over and over again. Well, it's the way to do it, you know.
I think that there was something you were asking specifically targeted to black students. Is that? Well, one of the things I think we're seeing that did not exist in such obvious fashion when I was a student is the success of this ideology or program that was called integration. I mean, at the time of the beginning of the civil rights movement, blacks were very largely excluded either by official, everyday, legal segregation or just by casual, customary segregation. So the black community and the community which sustains the activists was separate from the mainstream. And as a consequence of legal changes, social changes, some level of integration, which has been fairly low, but a lot of propaganda about integration, you have change the dynamic within the black community so that people who formerly had to work collectively together, had to live in the same place, had to do the same things, had to go to the same schools, now have a lot of choices and are fragmented. And not only are they fragmented, but fragmented in a class structure that didn't exist. For example, the numbers of people who see themselves as middle class are much larger now than when I was starting college in 1963, and furthermore, the number of people who have lost a sense of being committed to something we call the community, committed to the community. Black students in college said, we don't want to come here and just join the elite, we want to go and work in the community. And so that spirit seems to have been integrated out of them in a certain sense. And this notion that you could be liberated from something that people have been included in has been a victim of the ideological control. That's what I think. So I think people are not able to think in the same way about those issues, and you see a level of passivity that wasn't there because people aren't really correctly analyzing their position. That's my view.
You started to talk about Elmer Geronimo Pratt as an example of the COINTELPRO in the state. Could you briefly, if that's actually possible, discuss what's happened to him since the assassination in '69 up through this year?
Well, let me start with this year. In 1997, I think it was on June 10th, after 27 years in prison, after 5 attempts at habeas petition, all of which were turned down except the last, and after 2 months of hearings, the evidence that was used to convict Geronimo Pratt in a frame-up, an FBI-induced murder indictment against him, an unsolved murder case. They claimed that he did it. They worked together with the criminal conspiracy section of the Los Angeles Police Department, and on the testimony of an FBI informant within the Black Panther Party named Julio Butler, Pratt was convicted in 1972 of murdering a school teacher, and given a life sentence. And his attorney at that time was Johnny Cochran. He was a young attorney. He's gotten a lot better lately. And in the last case, the last time around, on a habeas petition filed in February of 1996, I believe. I can't keep track. I've been on so many of these cases. When he first initially tried, I was a witness. I was an alibi witness. And I said, no, he didn't do this murder. He was at Black Panther Party Central Committee staff meetings in Oakland for a whole week. Well, my testimony was repudiated because of the FBI guy, and he said that he did it, and he confessed to him and all these other things. Well, meanwhile, I grew up and went to law school, became a lawyer, worked on a lot of cases, worked on a habeas petition. Finally, we had a judge that had enough integrity to actually examine what had been done. Not a liberal judge, but a conservative judge. Not a judge in Los Angeles, but a judge in Orange County. And he looked at the record, he looked at the whole thing, and he said, this is a case that cries out for resolution. And he put this informant on the stand, and he looked at all the evidence, and he came to the conclusion that under the law that existed at that time, this man's conviction had to be invalidated. It should never have even happened, but that's what happened, and that's one example of COINTELPRO in that, yes, it is a victory, but what happened over those 27 years that he was locked down? So how do you replace that, and how do you see that? Whose victory is this? Anyway.
Okay, I guess we only have time for one more question, really.
What's going to happen?
Huh? What's going to happen? What's going to happen?
To get out of the building?
Well, no, it's just the people are telling me, all these people are running around going like this to me. Huh? I don't know. We'll try another. Well, let's try the question.
Hi, Roger Leisner, Radio Free Maine. Next month, Howard Zinn will travel to Berkeley, California to deliver the first annual Mario Savio lecture. Now, for those of you who don't know, Mario Savio was one of the leaders, founders of the free speech movement at the University of California back in the 60s. And I've noted that civil rights, the anti-war, free speech also seems to be one of those big issues that, you know, students gather around on campuses. What do you two see as some of the free speech issues of today. For instance, I know that some of the black college radio stations in the South have banned rap music from being played. There's also this whole issue of the V-chip and censorship in the internet and so on. But are there any particular free speech cases that stand out to you?
Well, by comparative standards, the United States has a very good record on freedom of speech, maybe the best in the world. And it's new. It's not our history. People who tell you it's in the First Amendment don't know American history. It's not in the First Amendment. In fact, the U.S. Supreme Court actually, passed the minimal test on freedom of speech in 1964 in the context of the Civil Rights Movement. When it finally invalidated the law against what's called seditious libel, meaning you can harm the state criminally by speech. And as free speech act, lawyers and specialists always said, that's the hallmark of a free society when you knock that down. Very few societies have knocked that down. It was done here. It was done as part of the civil rights struggle, which shows you how these things happen. But since that time, and in fact, the U.S. has a good record on freedom of speech. There are cases. There are cases of censorship which are, really bad and so on. But the really serious ones are not what are called censorship, in my opinion. They are the control over the arena of public discussion and information by private tyrannies. The country is, after all, run by what amount to totalitarian organizations. They're called corporations. If you look at a corporation, its internal structure mimics. It virtually mimics in the social and economic sphere what we call totalitarianism in the political sphere. And they are. It's true that they don't have the coercive power of the state. So you can choose not to rent yourself to them and to die from starvation. You're allowed that free choice. And they can't force you to do it. So it's different than state power. But the extent of their control over the decisions that matter in life is enormous and growing. And part of the general attack on democracy is the attempt to make it grow even further. The things that are very misleadingly called free trade acts, very little to do with free trade, most of them. You take a look at the way they're designed. Their basic design is to try to shift power even more into the hands of unaccountable private tyrannies and out of the public arena. Now, one part of that is control of the media. Concentration of control over the ability to find a place to express yourself and to reach and communicate with others. Now, that's not what's called censorship. So the American Civil Liberties Union doesn't make a fuss about that. Take, say, the example that Kathleen mentioned, this book it wasn't just mine and Edward Herman and I, he's an economist at the University of Pennsylvania. We've written a lot of things together, and this book was the first book we wrote together. Well, it wasn't technically censored. What happened is that the corporation that owned the publisher, the corporation is Warner Communications, this big monster. Warner Communications, a Warner Communications executive saw the ads for the book. The book was being published by a subsidiary of theirs. And they'd printed 20,000 copies or something. He saw the ads for the book. He didn't like it. He took a look at the book. He was totally scandalized. Without going through the details, he ended up closing down the publisher. Okay, that not only eliminated our book, incidentally, it eliminated their entire stock. Okay, in order to prevent this book from being distributed. I felt pretty powerful, I must say. But the point is that was not considered a violation of freedom of speech. Like Nat Hentoff wasn't interested, and the First Amendment absolutists didn't care, and the ACLU didn't care, because this is private power. This is private tyranny exercising its power, which is enormous. And that's what's happening, say, on the internet. The internet, after all, what's the internet? It's publicly funded. It's like virtually every part of modern technology, computers, airplanes, you name it. Public pays for it. And part of the reason why people like me get a salary is because MIT is part of the funnel whereby the public pays the costs of high technology industry. and then it ultimately gets into the pockets of the guys who own the place. Well, the internet is such an example, a dramatic example. Comes right out of the ideas, the technology, the software, the hardware. Everything comes out of the public sector. Here, it came out of originally DARPA, defense, the military funding agency, which is largely a method of, stimulating advanced technology. In Europe, it came out of CERN. It's where the basic ideas of the World Wide Web came from, also a public agency. Okay, after I don't know how many years, like 20, 30 probably years of public funding, design, innovation, everything else, you get this huge free system around. A year or two ago, it was handed over to private corporations, was commercialized. And they're happy to tell you what they're going to do with it. You read Bill Gates' new book. He tells you what the problem is with the internet. The problem is access is too easy, and there isn't enough advertising. Yeah, okay. So they'll take care of that. They'll arrange it, try to arrange it, so that access will be hard unless you want to go through the routines they want you to go through, which means like turning on a television set and listening to 20 minutes of ads before you can see the news or something. So they'll try to make it like that. And then if you really know what you want, like you're really hyper-driven and you want to find out something about a letter that appeared in Physical Review last month, yeah, you'll be able to do that because people like us have to maintain our privilege. But for most people, the idea is you'll be so inundated by something modeled on commercial TV, which is just a propaganda institution, that essentially the system will be lost and it'll be used for, again, for making people passive and separating them from one another and turning them into kind of consumerist atoms and making them hate each other and so on and so forth. Now, these are the problems of freedom of speech, in my opinion. Those are overwhelming problems, much more than the serious cases of the kind that you mentioned, of literal censorship. They're real. But in our society, they're not enormous. You should fight them because they shouldn't exist. But there's a much bigger monster out there that is not regarded as an attack on freedom of speech, and it should be. It's an attack on freedom of speech because it takes over the arena of public interchange and information and leaves only small margins on the outside for people to become involved in. That's a very serious attack on freedom of speech.
Okay, well, that's it.